The pilots were only minutes away from completing what should have been a routine arrival into the United Kingdom. Instead, a brief transmission from air traffic control would interrupt one of the most demanding phases of flight, triggering a chain of decisions that neither the crew nor the controller fully understood in the moment. Within seconds, an aircraft that had been following a stable automatic approach would drift toward disaster. When investigators later reconstructed the sequence, they found that no single failure had set the accident in motion. Instead, a series of individually manageable events aligned with remarkable precision until the crew's margin for recovery had almost disappeared. The story began several hours earlier at Liege Airport in Belgium, where a Boeing 737-300 freighter was being prepared for a short overnight flight to London Stansted. Operated by TNT Airways, the aircraft had spent most of its life carrying passengers before being converted into a cargo aircraft. Although nearly 2 decades old, it was maintained to the standards expected of a commercial airliner and had no significant technical defects before departure. The 2 pilots arrived from separate overnight assignments. Both were experienced enough to operate the aircraft safely, yet both had started work the previous evening and were now approaching the most fatiguing period of the human body clock. The captain had only recently upgraded to command, while the first officer was still building experience on the Boeing 737. Together, they formed a competent crew, but one with relatively limited experience managing unexpected situations together. During their preparation, one detail immediately attracted their attention. A notice to AMN reported that Stansted's instrument landing system was unavailable. If weather conditions deteriorated, they would be unable to fly the precision approach normally used in poor visibility and would instead depend on a surveillance radar approach directed by air traffic control. It was a perfectly acceptable procedure, but one that demanded higher weather minima and considerably greater cockpit workload. The weather forecast suggested there was only a modest possibility that visibility would become restricted around their arrival time. Even so, the captain chose to load additional fuel beyond the flight plan. It was a simple precaution that created more options if conditions changed. At the time, neither pilot had any reason to believe that this seemingly routine decision would later become one of the most important choices made before the aircraft ever left the ground. Shortly after departure, the flight settled into a routine climb as the first light of morning gradually replaced the darkness over Western Europe. The workload eased, allowing the crew to shift their attention from flying the aircraft to preparing for the arrival. For a flight lasting little more than an hour, descent planning would begin almost as soon as cruise conditions were established. The first officer tuned the arrival information broadcast from Stansted. Initially, the report was encouraging. Visibility remained above the minimum required for the available surveillance radar approach, and there appeared to be little reason to reconsider the plan. But weather conditions around London could change quickly, especially during the early morning hours when fog could develop with little warning. As the aircraft approached the area, updated reports showed a different situation developing. Visibility had fallen, and more importantly, runway visual range had dropped below the minimum required for the approach available that day. Without the instrument landing system, the crew could not simply continue towards Stansted and hope conditions improved. The options available to them were already becoming limited. Rather than divert immediately, the captain considered the wider picture. Morning fog often changes rapidly after sunrise, and the additional fuel loaded before departure had created exactly the flexibility needed for situations like this. Entering a holding pattern would allow time for the weather to improve while keeping several alternatives available if it did not. Air traffic control cleared the aircraft into a holding pattern northwest of Stansted at 6,000 feet. With the Boeing established in the racetrack pattern, the workload temporarily eased, but the decision-making pressure remained. Every additional circuit consumed fuel, and every passing minute reduced the number of choices available. The captain contacted company operations through the aircraft's data link, requesting guidance on the preferred alternate airport if a diversion became necessary. While waiting for a response, the pilots continued monitoring weather updates, recalculating fuel endurance, and reassessing their options. At the time, these decisions appeared routine: wait for improvement, preserve flexibility, and avoid diverting unnecessarily. But the choices made during this holding period would later become an important part of the investigation into why the flight continued toward East Midlands instead of abandoning the approach earlier. Instead of improving, conditions continued to deteriorate. Reports showed runway visual range falling even further, making an approach into Stansted increasingly unlikely. The extra fuel had provided valuable time to think, but it could not change the weather itself. Gradually, the discussion inside the cockpit shifted from whether they should divert to where they should go if conditions failed to recover. Eventually, the waiting came to an end, not because the weather had improved, but because the available options had become clearer than the uncertainty surrounding Stansted. Company operations responded and recommended East Midlands Airport as the preferred alternate. Although Liverpool offered better weather, East Midlands was more suitable from an operational perspective and had a Category III instrument landing system capable of supporting approaches in visibility far lower than Stansted could accept. After reviewing the latest weather reports one final time, the captain agreed with the diversion plan. Continuing to hold offered little advantage if conditions were still deteriorating. The first officer requested the new clearance, and air traffic control directed the aircraft toward East Midlands. The change of destination immediately increased the cockpit workload. The crew now had to prepare for an unfamiliar arrival while managing the normal demands of flight. Unlike modern electronic flight bags used today, pilots at the time relied heavily on printed approach charts carried in large binders. As the aircraft continued toward East Midlands, the first officer searched for the required procedures. The airport was listed under Nottingham, East Midlands, briefly slowing the process during an already busy phase of flight. Despite the added workload, the diversion itself remained orderly. The captain reviewed the expected approach while the first officer completed performance calculations, updated navigation information, and maintained communication with air traffic control. Their plan was a fully automatic Category III landing on runway 27. Both pilots were qualified for this type of operation, but automatic landings were not something most crews performed regularly. They were designed for situations where visibility was too poor for a normal approach, making precision and strict adherence to procedure essential. As the Boeing descended toward East Midlands, new weather reports confirmed that conditions remained poor, but still within the limits required for the airport's precision approach system. Air traffic control also confirmed that the runway lighting and navigation equipment required for the Category III approach were available. From a technical standpoint, everything appeared to be in place for a safe landing. However, the crew had now been awake through the most demanding part of their overnight duty period. Fatigue, changing plans, and the additional workload of a diversion had gradually increased the mental effort required for each task. None of these factors alone created a serious threat, but together they reduced the margin available if something unexpected occurred. The captain configured the aircraft for the autoland, engaging both autopilot systems and verifying that the navigation radios were correctly tracking the instrument landing system. By the time the Boeing intercepted the localizer, every indication suggested that the diversion had achieved its purpose. The aircraft was stabilized, the automation was functioning normally, the runway was directly ahead, hidden beyond the dense morning fog. From the crew's perspective, the most difficult decisions appeared to be behind them. They could not yet know that the most critical moments of the flight were still ahead. Descending through the cloud layer, Flight 325 captured both the localizer and glide slope exactly as planned. The Boeing transitioned smoothly onto the precision approach, with both autopilot systems engaged for the automatic landing. Outside the cockpit, the runway remained completely hidden behind dense fog. Inside, the pilots depended almost entirely on their instruments, watching for any indication that the aircraft was deviating from the carefully managed approach path. Tower cleared the flight to land, and the crew continued the final configuration for touchdown. During a Category III approach, every action followed a strict sequence. The captain monitored the overall approach and automation status, while the first officer focused on flight instruments, system indications, and required callouts. Everything appeared normal. The aircraft was stable, the navigation signals were reliable, the autoland system was performing exactly as expected. Then, at approximately 500 feet above the runway, an unexpected radio transmission interrupted the routine. The tower controller informed the crew that their operational authority had instructed them not to land and added that, at their discretion, they could perform a go-around. The message was unusual. It did not relate to any problem with the aircraft or runway environment, yet it arrived during one of the most demanding moments of the flight. A Category III approach leaves very little spare attention for unexpected information. For a brief moment, uncertainty entered the cockpit. The captain heard the transmission, but was unsure whether it was intended for Flight 325. The first officer, focused on monitoring the instruments and managing several tasks at once, did not immediately respond. The aircraft was still following the ILS perfectly, but the crew now had to interpret an unclear message while maintaining concentration during a critical phase of flight. Wanting confirmation before continuing, the captain instinctively reached for the push-to-talk switch on his control column. But in that moment, his thumb pressed the wrong button. Instead of transmitting on the radio, he disconnected the autopilot. A warning tone immediately filled the cockpit as both autopilot systems disengaged. The automatic landing capability was gone. At this altitude, the aircraft could no longer automatically complete a Category III landing. According to standard procedures, losing the required automation during this phase of flight meant the approach should be abandoned and a go-around initiated. But the situation was already moving faster than the crew could fully process. The captain first sought clarification from the tower, asking whether the message had been intended for their aircraft. The controller quickly confirmed that Flight 325 was still cleared to land. Those few seconds were critical. While the captain focused on understanding the transmission and attempting to restore the automation, the aircraft began slowly moving away from the precise ILS path. The deviation was initially small, almost invisible in the instrument indications, but in conditions where the outside world could not be seen, even a minor error required immediate attention. The aircraft was no longer in the same state it had been moments earlier. The approach that had appeared completely stable was beginning to unravel. The first officer noticed the change before the captain did. His attention remained fixed on the flight instruments, and the indications were no longer consistent with a stabilized Category III approach. The aircraft had begun moving above the glide slope while drifting left of the localizer. At first, the deviation appeared minor, but in near-zero visibility, there was almost no margin for correction. He called it out. 1 high. There was no immediate response. The captain was still focused on restoring the automation, believing that recovering the autoland system would return the aircraft to the stable approach it had moments earlier. What he did not yet realize was that below 800 feet, the aircraft systems would not allow both autopilots to re-engage. The automatic landing capability was already gone. As the deviation increased, the first officer repeated the warning, this time in French. Under normal circumstances, any significant deviation during a Category III approach required an immediate go-around. But the aircraft continued descending. Then, only seconds later, the enhanced ground proximity warning system activated. The warning cut through the cockpit. The captain looked outside. Instead of runway lights emerging through the fog, he saw grass. In that instant, the situation became clear. The aircraft was not approaching the runway anymore. The captain disconnected the remaining automation, advanced both thrust levers to maximum power, and initiated a go-around. The first officer announced the maneuver almost simultaneously. The response was correct, but it came too late. The Boeing struck the ground approximately 90 meters left of the runway centerline before climbing back into the air. The impact was violent but brief. The right main landing gear was torn away, the wing structure was damaged, parts of the flap system were affected, and one hydraulic system was lost. For a moment, the crew had to determine something crucial. Was the aircraft still controllable? Inside the cockpit, warnings appeared almost immediately. The aircraft that had only seconds earlier been configured for a routine landing was now a damaged airplane requiring emergency decision-making. The crew quickly changed priorities. Instead of attempting to analyze every failure at once, the captain concentrated on keeping the aircraft under control while the first officer worked through abnormal procedures and coordinated with air traffic control. With fuel continuing to decrease and the landing gear indicating an unsafe condition, they declared an emergency and requested vectors toward Birmingham Airport, where weather conditions offered the best possibility of a controlled landing. Even then, uncertainty remained. A police helicopter later reported visually that the aircraft appeared to be missing its right main landing gear. However, neither the crew nor controllers yet understood that the gear had separated completely during the impact at East Midlands. The pilots prepared for a landing they knew would likely end with the aircraft contacting the runway on its damaged right side. Approaching Birmingham, the captain positioned the aircraft toward the left side of the runway, creating additional space in case the aircraft veered after touchdown. The landing required exceptional control. The left main gear and nose gear touched down first. The captain held the damaged right wing as high as possible, delaying contact with the runway surface for as long as he could. Eventually, the right engine nacelle contacted the runway, and the aircraft began sliding along the surface while shedding speed. Emergency vehicles reached the aircraft within seconds. The Boeing came to a stop. Remarkably, both pilots survived without injury. The investigation that followed found that no mechanical defect had initiated the accident. Instead, investigators reconstructed a chain of events involving human factors, operational conditions, and decisions made during the final moments of the approach. An unexpected radio transmission during a critical phase of flight interrupted the crew's concentration. The accidental autopilot disconnect removed the protection of the automatic landing system, but the required go-around was not initiated immediately. Attempts to restore automation diverted attention away from manually monitoring the aircraft, while communication between the pilots was not strong enough to interrupt the developing deviation. The investigation also highlighted the combined influence of fatigue, increasing workload, and the challenges of low-visibility operations. None of these factors alone guaranteed an accident, but together, they reduced the crew's ability to recognize and stop the developing situation before the aircraft reached the point of no return. Flight 325 remains a reminder that aviation accidents rarely result from a single mistake. More often, they emerge from a sequence of ordinary events that gradually align until the available safety margins become dangerously small. In this case, the strength of the aircraft design, the crew's actions after the impact, and their ability to manage an extreme emergency prevented a serious accident from becoming a fatal one. The lessons learned from Flight 325 continue to influence pilot training, cockpit communication, and the way aviation manages the risks created by human factors.